My name is Kate Weaver. I'm Associate Professor here at the LBJ School, and I am delighted to chair the second panel, a panel that has the dubious title of Austerity, Labor, Life, and Politics in Europe, which is a little bit broad to say the least. But I hope it's an opportunity for us to really focus on some of the questions that have already surfaced in the conversation concerning the real politics and the real economy of Europe today. And so an assertion of political realism into a sophisticated argument. We've got 4 distinguished speakers. Each will be given about 15 minutes, sort of the advantage of having a smaller panel, and then we'll move as quickly as possible to a lively Q&A session. So I will be giving them the 5 2-minute and the time's up warning, and we will go in the order that we see here.
So good morning. I'm Damon Silvers. I'm the policy director of the AFL-CIO, the United States Trade Union Confederation. If some of you who may remember Monty Python from the 1970s, I think the best way for me to introduce what I'm going to say is, and now for something completely different. Because what I'm going to do is I don't have a model for how to turn the European Union into a true fiscal union. I thought that the ones that were presented by the last panel were all directionally correct, and I appreciated the distinctions among them. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to tell you some stories about what has happened in the euro crisis over the last several years, and what those stories I think will tell you at the end of my presentation is the severity of the crisis of the political economy in Europe in much the way that I think Tom Ferguson really was trying to push on it in the last panel. And in case you don't believe him, I'm going to tell you what it feels like a little bit from the inside. I'm going to do this from 2 perspectives. One is it's probably not well known here, but the president of the AFL-CIO serves as the chair of the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD, and as such participates in the deliberations of the OECD in the status of a member government, more or less. And I've had the honor and privilege of being party to that throughout the Euro crisis as staff to him. And secondly, I'm going to tell you some stories about the way that the European labor movement has responded to it as we've witnessed it, the Euro crisis, as we've witnessed it here in the United States. The European labor movement and the U.S. labor movement are the key institutions historically in the global trade union movement, and have a long fraternal relationship that really has its deep origins in the last time this all got messed up in the 1930s. So let me begin by saying that I really got a sense of what the Euro crisis was going to be like although I didn't realize quite what this meant, when in the fall of 2009 I was invited to dinner at the German embassy in Washington, had the opportunity to meet a senior official in the German finance ministry, not the finance minister, at dinner. And I turned to him and I said what was on a lot of Americans' mind at that time, which was, it doesn't seem very wise for Germany to starve or strangle its major trading partners in Europe. That just doesn't seem like a very smart thing to do. But there must be something we don't understand. Right? There must be, because clearly the people that we're dealing with in Germany, German government, are very smart people. What is it that we're missing? And so I posed this question to the senior official of the German finance ministry, and he said to me, "Oh, those countries aren't really that important to us. It doesn't really matter what they buy from us. What we care about is China." Now, I think as an omen of things to come, that was not a bad thing to understand. I think it turns out not to be true, but it was, I think, a good window into the type of thinking that has produced the environment we have today. The second little anecdote I'll tell you is that not long after that, I was at a dinner at the Austrian ambassador to the EU's house, with a cross-section of the Austrian political elite and a number of people from different European countries, including a number of German diplomats and think tank types. And there were no Greeks there. And a fascinating conversation ensued about what to do about Europe. And it became very clear that the representatives from the smaller countries and the people who were there from France were extremely concerned about the fate of Europe as an institution, as a thing, much as this conference is concerned with the fate of Europe as a thing. But that the representatives, the people who were there representing the German political class, were concerned about something else. They were mostly concerned with how to manage the kind of moral politics of the European crisis inside Germany. And as a result, and the way that that was expressed in this dinner, which was, among friends, this was not a dinner of people of, this was not the equivalent in Europe of the Tea Party dining with Bernie Sanders. This was a group of people relatively similar points of view politically within their own societies. It very quickly felt to me as an outsider as though the mask of civility was very close to coming off. That, in fact, that history was looming in that room in an extremely frightening way. And as someone with a deep sense of history, both in the United States and Europe, I was looking around to make sure there were no guns in the corners. Now, I think those two anecdotes tell you something about the political and psychological climate in which the profound policy mistakes in dealing with Greece and now Spain have been made. It's very telling to me, as someone who was intimately involved in the oversight of the US bank bailout, that the total amount of Greece's external debt is less than the amount of money that the Treasury Department guaranteed for one US bank in the fall of 2008, Citigroup, which goes back to the point of prior panelists that this should have been handled in a different way right at the beginning. But the stories I just told you a little bit about the politics and the psychology that prevented it from happening. And so then we now deal with a different politics and a different psychology, the politics and psychology surrounding the Troika, and what happened and what has happened as austerity policies, fundamentally the very same policies that the Treasury Secretary of the United States, Andrew Mellon, recommended to Herbert Hoover in 1930 in response to a similar situation, which was liquidate everything, by which he meant push down prices, push down values in everything, and particularly in labor. Right? What has happened as those policies have been implemented by the Troika, and as could be completely predicted, they have resulted in, at best, economic stagnation, vast human suffering, and profound and increasing political instability. And here I want to take you to a meeting of the OECD, actually two meetings of the OECD. The OECD has a ministerial meeting every May in which they release their economic outlook. The first meeting that I attended that was really about this was on the anniversary of the OECD. I think it was the 60th anniversary of the OECD's creation. 50? No, it was in 2012, so. 60 plus 50 is 12. Right, so I think it's the 60th. But in any case, well, it was in 2012. The amazing thing about this celebration was that, as we often remind Angel Gurria, the OECD was created to be an institution to try to ensure we didn't do this. It was the whole point of the OECD's creation after the war, was to be a kind of institutional glue to keep anyone in Europe from repeating Andrew Mellon's policy direction and returning fascism. That's what the OECD was for. And this anniversary, 50th or 60th, occurred at the moment in which the OECD had essentially become enlisted with the IMF and the ECB on doing precisely what it was designed not to do. And in this meeting, the leading officials of the OECD were talking about how things were getting better, and the euro crisis was ending, and that good policies had succeeded. And literally, while they were saying this into the microphones, they had these big TV, you know how everything nowadays, they have big TV screens and computer screens everywhere. And if you've been to the OECD headquarters in Paris, nobody tops them in this. They've got computer screens and TV screens everywhere. And the little problem that they had was what those TV screens and computer screens were showing, literally, as the senior officials of the OECD were proclaiming that victory and the triumph of good policy, were the youth of Athens throwing gasoline bombs at the police. Now, that led the next year to the astounding spectacle of Pierre Padoan, the chief economist of the OECD, declaring at the same event, the annual release of the numbers, the statement that and I quote, and I think this stands for me for the entire euro crisis, countries that are doing the right thing are nonetheless going over the cliff. Now, you think carefully about what that statement means. The president of the AFL-CIO on the panel that followed that speech said, consider the possibility that if countries are doing the right thing and nonetheless going over the cliff, that perhaps they're not doing the right thing. Perhaps your notion of what the right thing is needs to be rethought. And finally, the last time I was in Europe, I spoke with a very senior official of the European labor movement, who said the following thing to me. This person said, in all of Europe, north and south, in Germany, in Scandinavia, in Greece, Italy, Spain, France, Europe as a concept is unpopular, increasingly unpopular. It is associated with declining living standards for workers in the South, particularly in Greece and Spain, the destruction of collective bargaining, the conscious destruction of workers' rights by the ECB and the IMF as a conscious policy matter. You can look at the OECD's report for Economic Outlook for 2013. There's an explicit recommendation that Spanish employers void collective bargaining agreements. This is the sort of thing that if you go and take it over to the ILO is a labor rights violation. In the North, what this person said, in the North, where these things are not going on yet, Europe is associated with the undermining of collective bargaining in other ways, not all of which are politically correct to say, but are what people think there, which is that effectively immigration from the poor parts of Europe are undercutting standards in the richer parts of Europe. That may not be what I think, but that's what workers are saying in those countries. The consequence of this, my colleague said, is that the right, the National Front and all of its fraternal organizations through Europe, the right are systematically stripping the trade union movement, and this person wasn't explicit about this, but the Social Democrats as well, of their electoral base. And this person said, finally, given what is going on the merits, I should be against Europe. I should be in favor of the withdrawal from Europe of countries like Spain and Greece, where the official unemployment rate, on an apples-to-apples basis with U.S. unemployment numbers, to make sure people understand what we're talking about, the official unemployment rate's between 25 and 30%. And since we're doing it on an apples-to-apples basis with U.S. numbers, one should pretty much presume that's not the real number. It's substantially higher. That these countries, on the merits, working people's interest is that these countries leave the euro. The working people in those countries. But this person says, I cannot support that personally because I refuse to sit at the same table with the National Front. Right? Everything I am, everything that the European labor movement stands for, cannot allow us to do that. But the longer we hold that position, the more we are sitting alone. And now, what can we draw from this? The political danger here is extremely real. Right? I was really concerned by the statement that so much credit is due to countries like Spain and Greece for having reduced their deficits, their current account imbalances and the like. You know what it's like to have 25% unemployment? None of us do. I mean, I don't think, is there anyone here who is, say, over 95? 25% unemployment is a society in such profound pain and with such levels of human suffering. The only people who could possibly be satisfied with such an arrangement are the people whose primary economic existence is embodied in their investment or employment at high levels in the banks that were just bailed out. No one else could possibly be satisfied with that type of society. And let me suggest that if you look at the United States, which just went through this same basic set of policy choices, which were admirably summarized by the last panel, meaning that we effectively focus public policy on rescuing financial institutions without accountability, and and we had underpowered stimulus, which was then replaced with austerity starting in 2010, fortunately mitigated by our central bank, a real central bank, which the Europeans don't quite have. If you look at our experience, what it suggests is where this is headed for countries like Greece and Spain, the so-called recovery, right, in these same set of circumstances, is modest GDP growth on a diminished base. This is what the European establishment is currently celebrating, this 0.3% growth. And the very, very slow diminishment of unemployment until you get somewhere like where the United States is right now, with unemployment, say, at about 80% of its crisis peak. What is 80% of a crisis peak of 28% unemployment? If that's the sustained future, does anyone really believe that the political structure is going to hold? Now, I think, looking at my friend Gustav, that Gustav's going to tell me I'm being optimistic. I'm just simply analogizing to the United States. And we had significant advantages here in the United States. We did have a stimulus. It was not only half what it needed to be, but we did have one. And we did have a central bank that pushed very hard against austerity over the last 3 years and continues to do so. And we also had, and I'm going to conclude this, we also had this advantage that I can't resist saying here in Texas, which is that I'll go back to my dinner at the Austrian ambassador's house. The former chancellor of Austria at that dinner asked me, how did the United States resolve this question of our accountability, of who was going to answer for the debts of other states, and how did we synthesize a federal fiscal union? How was that settled? And my answer was, well, we have an advantage. We settled that at Appomattox. Thank you.
Okay. Not sure if it's, oh, yes it is. Thank you very much, Damon, for very provocative comments. So now we've set a tone for this panel. Let me see, the mask of civility is coming off. Countries that are doing the right thing are going over the cliff. And does anyone really believe that the political structure will hold? So with that, we pass the torch off to Gustav, and we ask him to answer those questions.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I belong to that whole bunch of German who I'm afraid are a bunch of totally unrepresentative Germans. Because I'm afraid that what has Damon said previously is all right, and that represents much more of the German insight into the present crisis than we provide here, which I think nevertheless is very necessary to tell you. And having in mind what has been said in the last panel, I must say all these suggestions are very good and very wise and very smart. But what we really desperately need, apart from changing institutions which have not proved sustainable during this crisis, is a change of economic policy. And just imagine we have a Euro treasury called Olli Rehn doing the same policy as he does. I must confess I wouldn't sleep well with that. And so my presentation is just about, was the present policy successful? Damon has told us something about that. And how can we measure that victory? And what should be changed? And this all in a nutshell. So I will tell you something about the economic situation. I will say something about the decisive role of the ECB and the dismal impact of fiscal austerity, and outline some systematic errors. So look at victory. Taking GDP to 100 in 2008 and just adding up to the most actual data. So there's only one country outlined here that has a GDP that is higher than before crisis. It is Germany, slightly higher. All other countries, at best, like France, are on level. And then you see those countries who are the countries who are in crisis, which have a GDP which is at the extreme 20 percentage point lower than before the crisis. And that's Greece as the most extreme case. They lost 25% of their GDP during this crisis. If that's victory, I don't want to see defeat. And this is reflected, it has also been said, by the unemployment figures. If you have such a loss of GDP, of value added, you will definitely have an increase in unemployment. It's unavoidable, and yet what you see here. Spain and Greece have unemployment figures beyond scope of any political sustainability. And Damon has outlined it here. Just imagine for the United States to have such a kind of figures, what would be going on here? I mean, and we say, this is victory. Again, I don't want to see defeat. Let us look at one aggregate which is always underestimated, which is by some economists even said it's a big evil. It's consumption. You should not consume too much. That's a standard phrase of economists. And what you see here, for example, that the country that is most successful in relative terms, Germany, has had a fairly steady consumption throughout this crisis. And I outline this because this is the answer to the German miracle we have had during the financial market crisis. Because Germany made a lot of right things during that crisis, which are now officially not being talked of many, because they're in opposite to what is the official line of rescue policies towards other countries. Germany did a very odd thing during that crisis. It stabilized demand. It made a significant stimulus package. It made something very ingenious, which was it had very flexible working hours, supported by state subsidies, but also supported by the trade unions and the employers' association by adjusting working time to the output, but with almost unchanged income. And that allowed people, in the first place, to stay employed, so unemployment didn't rise in Germany that much as in other countries, and in particular, incomes stayed fairly constant during that time, providing a miracle during that crisis, because German consumption didn't go down during that deep, deep crisis we have seen. And that is a part of the success story. And now look to the other countries in crisis. You see how consumption is going down, is declining, because all this kind of wage restraint we impose on people is reducing income. And as we have rightly heard by Enno in the previous panel, the income effect outweighs the substitution effect of such a kind of policy. So you will never be successful if you do this kind of strategy. You will not compensate by more exports created by the substitution effect, by devaluating, then you lose by reducing the income of your employees. So this strategy is doomed to fail if you have these kinds of results. But the main target of this, the main objective of this policy was to reduce the public debt burden. Look at the success. Again, even the main objective of that policy strategy was not achieved. The opposite turned out. The debt burden has been increased. And it's quite obvious why. If you reduce GDP by such an amount, tax revenue will stall, and you will never have a chance to reduce your deficits significantly. Sure, it is being said now that structural deficits have been reduced in Greece, that have even now recently a primary surplus. Well, what does it matter? If the cyclical deficit outweighs that surplus by far, that means in the end, Greece will have a higher debt burden, and it has to pay for it. So this is certainly a kind of strategy which has not proven very successful. And now let me show you a graph that is very sad. If we compare, and one of my colleagues did that at the Institute, if we compare the situation in Germany during the Great Depression in the 1930s with the situation in Greece today, just economically, not politically, although, you see that the economic performance of both countries in these both situations is quite similar. So Greece is suffering the same strain presently as Germany has suffered during the 30s. And that illustrates the political pressure we have now in these kind of countries, and that illustrates the political dangers we see in these kinds of countries. And I wonder what kind of success, assumed success, justifies this kind of strategy, politically and ethically. And one thing was successful, and I will show you that too. Yield spreads, reflecting the risks in these countries. And what do you see? 2 years ago, I think that was the time of your first conference where everybody was very much concerned, the euro crisis was in the headlines and everybody was talking about that the Eurozone would break within 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 weeks. And then something happened what has calmed down markets significantly. The ECB stepped in and just made a declaration, nothing else, to do what is necessary to do to stabilize the euro area. That was enough to calm down markets significantly up to today and let the euro crisis vanish from the headlines. I could describe it with a kind of medical image. Economists laugh. The patients were allowed to enter the intensive care. So it could be, at least the life could be saved. But certainly this patient is not able to run or to walk some steps. It's still laying down. It's very, very ill, but it is to some extent stable. And that thing should have happened much earlier. It should have happened right at the beginning. And I tell you, if that would have happened right at the beginning, when the first signs of the euro crisis came in fall 2009, we wouldn't sit here and have this conference, I must say. Because many of the fears, many of the speculation, many of the panic we have seen since then wouldn't simply haven't happened. And that would be the case if the ECB would simply act like, for example, the Fed acts in such a kind of situations. And now, let me tell you about the systematic errors of that policy. How can I tell about that? These people in the EU Commission or in the ECB or in the IMF at the beginning are no evil people. They thought they did the very best for these countries. They didn't want to have this kind of higher unemployment. I assume that at least, and I think I have good reasons to assume. And so why, nevertheless, they could make such a kind of policy? Because they were thinking that the impact of this, the adverse impact of that policy would not be so adverse as they turn out right now. And technically phrased, they assumed a kind of multiplier of 0.5, which was in line with all mainstream economic analysis, 0.5 is a good estimate, a sophisticated estimate. We can work with that at least. And so the assumption was, okay, we will have a kind of dip in the economy, but this is a minor dip and will go away very soon, and it's justified by the kind of structural adjustment we have to make. And their forecasts, how the development of the Greek economy, for example, I will show you, is based on these kind of assumptions. And they made this forecast, they do it twice a year, and after half a year they revise it and update it. So I show you now the forecast of the EU Commission on Greece since 2009. What do you see? Well, the first forecast, which is the upper blue line, oh, it's blue, yes, said, okay, there will be some sort of dip in the economy and the economy will be flat for some time. No big worry, yes. Half a year later, the worry was a bit more, but not really big worry. Then the economy broke down, and they had acknowledged that in the next forecast, but they said, okay, it has come worse than we thought, but next year it will be better. And this kind of process is happening until today. The worse the situation gets, the more optimistic you are for next year, because it gets much better. That I call optimism. But the real story is very sad. I mean, I'm a forecaster myself, and I commit errors myself too. And you have not always a complete picture. There are many insecurities in the system. But if you look at your forecasts, you should not detect a systematic error, although you should ask yourself some very serious questions. So you can make errors to one side and to the other side, but you should not err systematically on one side. Since 2009, and that's what this graph shows, the EU Commission has erred systematically on the wrong side, always being too optimistic, always claiming victory, and always having a defeat half a year later. And the serious question that you should ask yourself in this case is, do I really understand the impact of my policy, or is my model systematically wrong? And the answer is, as we now know from different kinds of research, among them the research of the IMF, is the model was systematically wrong. Because the multiplier is not 0.5. It's much higher, and it becomes the higher the longer the crisis lasts, the deeper the recession is. That's the basic lesson we have from recent research on that. And given that, it is quite obvious that this kind of austerity policy can't function. So we must change the course fundamentally, or everything is in vain and the Eurozone is doomed to go down. So first of all, the positive point is the ECB intervention was helpful to restore trust. We should keep that in mind. I must remind you, we have a constitutional complaint about this kind of ECB policy in Germany going on. And some people say the Constitutional Court in Germany will decide against that policy. But we must keep in mind, if that's happening, the Eurozone is dead. Secondly, fiscal austerity is in a mess. You have to change that policy immediately. No longer any more austerity measures. You can change structurally a lot of things. Certainly the Greek tax system, the Greek administration needs structural change. I will not deny that at any point. But stop austerity, immediately pressure on wages, immediately make sort of wage pacts, stabilize wages, stabilize income to stabilize consumption, as Germany has done during the financial crisis. And this kind of fiscal strategy must be complemented by a wage strategy. The declining wages imply declining incomes, imply declining income expectations, and imply that consumption is going down and GDP is going down in the economy. You have to stop that. You have to give a perspective to people on their incomes. So this kind of pressure on wages does not help you to overcome the crisis. Because again, and finally, if that's victory, what we see, I don't want to see defeat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gustav, and perfect timing, by the way. So that was indeed very compelling and even more pessimistic comments than what Damon offered us before. So on the heels of Gustav's comment, is there, if this is victory, I don't want to see defeat. Terri, can you give us any optimism for Europe? No. Okay.
I'm not used to the Mac, so how do I put this down?
Escape, escape, escape.
Oh, wait, there it is. Okay. Is your arrow? Okay, there we go. And then just hit this.
F5.
There we go. All right. So I'm the political scientist in the group, and my work has mainly been on immigration politics in Europe, but my first book was actually on radical right parties in Europe. I studied closely the Austrian Freedom Party, the German Republikaner, the French National Front, and the Danish People's Party, and I spent also a good chunk of time in articles on EU immigration policy over the years, and most recently, I'll give a plug for my latest book, which is coming out in April with Oxford University Press on anti-discrimination policy in Europe. But today, I want to talk about some of the overlapping crises that are occurring in Europe. I point to fault lines because, of course, what we've heard already this morning is that fault lines have been created between North and South, between the employed and unemployed, and so on, because of the Euro crisis. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the political issues that have come up and how immigration is playing into this. So, first of all, let's see if I can get this to come up. So this is a focus on illegal immigrants, and this looks at the various routes into Europe and where the people are coming from. So if we look, obviously it's going to be the periphery that's impacted the most, and we can see, and I'll talk a bit about what's been going on with the Mediterranean crossings, but we have people coming from the eastern borders, the Western Balkan routes, Western Mediterranean, Central Mediterranean, and so on. People coming via Turkey through Greece, and so if we look at the number of illegal border crossings, there are estimates for each of these routes and the top three nationalities. Obviously, crisis regions or regions in conflict, like Afghanistan, Syria, and so on, are part of that, but also Kosovo, Pakistan, and other routes. We have people coming from Georgia, Somalia, Afghanistan again, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Albania, coming from Albania to Greece. Again, so clearly one of the top places is Afghanistan, coming through the eastern routes, and obviously northern Africa, and in some cases sub-Saharan Africa through the other routes. So just to give you an idea where these people are coming from. And so the countries on the front lines are considered Cyprus, Greece, Italy, and Spain. Malta could also be thrown in there as well. And of course, these countries are also on the front lines of the Euro crisis. So we have all these conflicts that are going on in Africa and the Middle East. We have the Arab Spring, which led to a large flow of refugees to the island of Lampedusa, and that was a humanitarian crisis at the time. And more recently, we've seen the boats basically capsizing. 300 people, over 300 people were killed, were drowned recently, and actually there was a more recent one where I think around 50 refugees, migrants were also drowned. And so we have these flows, but these flows have been going on for a long time. There are a variety of push factors, including conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa. More recently, Eritrea and Somalia have been the source of refugees. And so Italy, a couple of years ago, was complaining to the other EU countries. It's like, hey, look, we're taking on this burden, and realistically, we can't really afford it. We need help. There wasn't much of a response. And a lot of the immigrants were coming from French-speaking countries, and a lot of them wanted to get to France. And so what Italy did is like, okay, if you guys aren't going to respond to us, we're going to put them on, we're going to give them temporary status, we're going to put them on trains, and we're going to ship them to France. And so the French said, wait a second, we don't like that. And so they did get together, and actually they stopped some of the trains at the border, which is of course against the Schengen Agreement. The Schengen Agreement basically calls for open borders between EU countries, and so they're not really supposed to be stopping the trains to check people's status, but they did at that point. And so this is, in general, has been a challenge for the broader Schengen agreement. There have been discussions about potentially changing the Schengen agreement and so on. But I also think it's important to note that the countries like Cyprus, Greece, Italy, and Spain that are suffering high levels of unemployment, these economic declines, are also having to deal with these immigrants who are coming in. And actually, this is not a new issue. This has been something that has been an issue for a long time in Europe, particularly how to deal with undocumented immigrants in labor markets, coming to agreements at the EU level on how to deal with just general immigration flows. And so in the process of this, they created and of course borders are an issue, so in the process of this, they created the Frontex agency, which is supposed to, at a minimum at least, coordinate border issues, but they don't really have an active status. So even though they are coordinating things, they aren't actually out there there's no Frontex ships out there in the Mediterranean patrolling. Of course, it's individual country ships out there patrolling the Mediterranean, and NATO ships and so on. And so this leads to varying responses in terms of how to deal with different refugees, and a lot of discussion about, to what extent people should be sent back versus allowed to land, because once they are allowed to land, then they have to be processed and so on. So there's a lot of issues that are revolving around this, but it's also an issue for these countries because, of course, they're dealing with a broader crisis. And so it's interesting, I was just reviewing a book proposal that was talking about how the fiscal crisis has pushed the issue of immigration out of the headlines to a certain extent. But in actuality, it's definitely there under the surface, and we're seeing this in the rise of far-right parties, populism, and the radical right. And so I've been following fairly closely what's happening with these different parties as they prepare for the European Parliament elections. And clearly, it's not. One of the interesting things I've seen that has developed since I wrote my book, which came out in 2005, on the radical right, is that it's not just EU, or rather what the EU would call third country nationals, people coming from outside of the EU. Now one of the major focuses is intra-EU migration. And so when you talk about fault lines, we're not just talking about, we've got these immigrants coming from Arab countries and externally. In the UK, there's a lot of concern about Eastern European immigrants. And even though the UK is not part of the Eurozone, they've certainly been at the center of what's going on with the broader global fiscal crisis, as well as the EU crisis, for that matter. And you're seeing in other countries the rise of parties in Hungary like Jobbik. And of course, one of the more infamous parties is Golden Dawn in Greece. And as Damon Silvers was saying, we have this situation where people who previously, and I've been studying, this has been going on since the 80s really, the shift of voters from left-leaning social democratic parties to the far-right parties. As some political scientists and sociologists have called it, it's the, this clear shift, and I'm going to forget the term because I didn't have it in my head, but that you're seeing a interesting shift from of people who would normally be voting for left parties actually voting for parties like the National Front and so on, because they feel that these parties are actually addressing the issues in a way that the left parties won't and can't. And so you have a situation again where the left parties, as Damon pointed out, are struggling to try and maintain their connection with these voters who are, deeply impacted by the fiscal crises, not just in Greece and Spain and Italy, but in France. Marine Le Pen in the last presidential election got a much higher percentage. She's not going to win the presidency of France. That's just not going to happen. But she did get close to 18% of the vote, which was higher than her father had ever previously gotten in the first round of the French presidential election. And so, as I point out here, this is a quote from a column I was reading the other day. The immigration has become a toxic political issue, especially as high levels of unemployment and the economic crisis have fueled a growing anti-immigration sentiment across Europe. And I think this is going to have a major impact on the European Parliament elections. And so these fault lines are coming out through the immigration issue. So you've got the actual reality of immigrants coming from outside of Europe who are, in a sense, worse off than even some of the people in these countries. They're coming into a situation, even though it may be better than the country they're leaving, many of them are now homeless. I keep reading these stories about just regular people who are in Greece and Eastern European immigrants who've gone to the UK, living in caves. Homelessness is on the rise, and so if we think about the unemployment levels particularly for youth, we haven't even talked about to any detail about youth unemployment, where in places like Greece and Spain it's 50-60%. It's even higher for immigrants. In many situations, not in every situation, but in many situations. And I don't have the exact figures on it. And actually, I'm surprised I'm wondering if there aren't any studies out there that are looking at the impact of the Euro crisis, and particularly the contraction of these economies in the southern part of Europe, the impact on their African and Asian trading partners, because there's clearly got to be a connection between, these flows that are coming from these other countries into Europe, where they're hoping the situation is better, but where they're often finding that they're worse off than they were, and often, unfortunately, many of them are dying as they're trying to make the crossing. But in any case, I don't want to take too much time, but just to kind of conclude that there's the linkage between the external migration, and both legal and illegal, that's coming into Europe to the fiscal crisis, in the sense that there's clearly impacts that are being felt outside of Europe in countries that are have strong trading relationships with European countries. And then you have the situation with intra-EU migration, and both of those situations with intra-EU and external migration are having an impact on the politics, where far-right parties are taking advantage of these issues, as well as the Euroscepticism. So a lot of these parties, the UKIP in the UK has been, the people focus more on the fact that it's a Eurosceptic party, but it's also very anti-intra-EU migration. You have the National Front. I mean, you could go, there are far-right parties in every country, and I'm very curious to see how they're going to do in the European Parliament elections. And, in Germany even has its own Eurosceptic party now, the Alternative für Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany. which did as well as the FDP in the last election, around 4.8%. But in any case, I'll wrap up just saying that there are a lot of human costs to what's going on, and I'm sure Jamie could comment ad nauseum on the inequalities that are being created in this situation, not just between North and South, within Europe, but just within the broader global context. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Terri, very much for also dissuading us from the notion that political science is not the dismal science. But just so we know that the mask of civility is in fact coming off, key points here about labor, life, and politics in Europe. It's not only attack from misguided austerity policies, but from a broader global crisis in immigration that is compounding fault lines, contributing to the rise of the radical right and political decay. So on that note, George Stathakis, we invite you to come up and please provide us a little bit of hope before lunch, if possible.
Well, I'm glad that we all love Greece nowadays, for one reason or another. But let me summarize what I'm going to argue. A, the Greek program is a complete failure. B, the main cause of economic destruction of Greece is not the problems of the Greek economy prior to 2008, it's the Greek program itself. C, the Greek program itself does not arrest none of the problems that the Greek economy had prior to 2008. And four, the only thing we can do is get rid of this ridiculous program. Let me remind you for a moment, what is the Greek program all about? The Greek program came at the forefront because Greece had a public debt crisis. Markets stopped refinancing the Greek public debt. Let me make a small historical note on this. The Greek public debt was created in the 1980s, not in 2008, as most people think. Greece has already 120% of its GDP as a public debt back in 1993, and it remained at this level, 100 to 120%, since 1993, from 1993 until 2008. So in effect, the low interest refinancing of the Greek public debt was not the cause of the Greek public debt. The Greek public debt was created in the 1980s for two reasons: A, the expansion of the Greek welfare state that did not exist prior to 1980, and B, the management of the deindustrialization back there. So in effect, in the Greek public debt crisis, it is emerged, was attempted to be resolved in a specific way that was not founded in any economic theory. Let me remind you that when you do have a public debt crisis in economic theory, no matter whether you are monetarist, neoliberal, Keynesian, radical, or whatever else, there are three ways out of the public debt problem: forgiveness, inflation, growth. In the Greek case, we have a fourth theory that was never has no economic sounding at its background. We have a fourth theory, which is the typical Hooverism that we recall in the economic historians, which is exactly a political mentioning of a specific president because it is not based on any economic theory. The idea is that you can pay back your public debt through austerity and balancing your budget and doing various other things. Well, that is the Greek program. The premises of the Greek program are very simple. Bring the economy back into a position that will be able to repay its debt, its public debt. And this is done through four basic things. A, the most drastic fiscal adjustment ever implemented in any Western society, ever. The fiscal adjustment program of Greece is 20% of its GDP within 4 years. I repeat, 20% of the GDP within 4 years. This is the fiscal adjustment program of Greece. Greece had roughly a 15% of its GDP as a fiscal deficit at the peak of the crisis, and we are supposed to get a surplus of 4.5% of our GDP at the 4th and 5th year of the program, 2013-2014. So we have a 20% adjustment, which includes 2/3 public expenditure cuts, 1/3 increase in taxation, 14% of the GDP public expenditure cuts, 7%. All this within a 4-year period. And this was implemented. That is what has been happening in Greece. We made a 20% adjustment of the GDP, fiscal adjustment within 4 years. The end result, A, recession rate, the highest ever after 1929 in any Western economy. The recession rate, it goes on in 2013, will go on most likely in 2014, has been 26% of our GDP. It collapsed within a 4-year period. B, unemployment rate, 29% of our GDP, of our employment force, from something in the range of 8 to 9% unemployment rate that we had 3 years ago, 4 years ago. So this is the idea. And then we have 3 minor targets that are focusing on the specific problems of the Greek economy, that the 2 problems of the Greek economy, according to the Greek program, was the fiscal deficit, A, and B, the balance of payment problem. So we have 3 other issues that the Greek program pursues successfully to some extent. Reduction of wages in the private sector, 40% reduction in wages within a 4-year period. B, privatizations, I will explain in a minute why it completely failed, and institutional reforms. The idea that the Greek state, the state administration is in a very bad shape, and that prevents development. The 3 elements, B, wages, C, privatizations, and institutional reforms, all failed completely, because this is what we call the development agenda of the Greek program. They were supposed to counterbalance the huge recession that the fiscal adjustment program would produce, and everybody knew it would produce such a huge adjustment. And I thank Gustav, because he indicated the successive predictions of IMF and Troika on how the Greek economy would respond in 2011, 12, 13, and 14. And they are far away from reality. The idea of the failure has to do with this development agenda. Let us go back to it. A, the Greek economy is facing a competitiveness problem, indicated that it produces low exports and has a lot of imports because of high wages. Greek wages went up 40% between 1998 and 2008, and this is correct. But this was the rate of growth of the Greek economy. It was the fastest growing economy in Europe. On average, GDP increased 40 to 45% within the same period. So the idea that if we take back wages to 1996, which we did, will solve the problem, does not sound very rational. We did it, but there is no employment. B, the idea that Greece is lacking in privatization because of the huge state sector was ill-founded, because Greece had a record of privatization between 1996 and 2008, when the Greek economy adjusted to the neoliberal agenda that was predominant at the time. It had a record of privatization, including banks, all the state companies, telecommunications, even the Athens airport is private, the infrastructural projects went private, and a whole range of privatization. So practically in Greece, there is a very small state business sector, very small. It has to do with electricity, water, and a few other minor companies. So when IMF, if you read the first report of IMF, the Greek program #1, and you go to the chapter of privatizations there, you realize how IMF came up with the idea that what we are going to get from privatization in Greece is roughly something in the range of 20% of its GDP, 50 billion. That was the first privatization target in Greece, 50 billion euros. And we go to the specific page of IMF and we realize the rule of thumb that IMF used in the Greek case. It used the rule of thumb that in the 1990s, wherever we went, in Latin America, Africa, or Eastern Europe, on average, it was a 20% of GDP package of privatization. So that's more or less what we expect to get in Greece as well. Now, the 50 billion target of Greek Program 1 became 22 billion in Greek Program 2, and after 5 years, we have gained from privatization 1.9 billion. That's the Greek program, master design on how growth will be produced through privatization. And because privatization, we ran out of it, then we thought that the second element is the Greek public land. We should sell the Greek public land or give it to private investors because the Greek state has too much land. Every state has some land, I suppose. And that's the Greek solution to the development agenda. It failed also completely. I won't go into any detail to this. And there were a number of institutional reforms. The ideas that we should open up some of the highly protected professions, taxi drivers, lorry drivers, etc., with a recession rate of 10% annually. All this opening up of professions was practically nobody gave any mention to it because it's the last thing you can ever think when there are taxi drivers in Athens, lazy all day long waiting for one or a second passenger to appear. So the reform was completely collapsed. That was a Greek program, a complete failure of the growth pattern. Then we had a number of ideas that did not last long. Free economic zones where foreign investors would come in the model of part of Turkey, part of China, part one in Poland. It didn't work. I mean, it's not close to the European standards. And the idea that if we dissolve any protection of labor on labor, and they did it, there is no collective bargaining anymore in Greece. It's only European countries with no collective bargaining. The minimum wage went down 3 times, probably to go a 4th time as well. So the idea is that the whole system did not work. So the fiscal adjustment program produced huge recession, huge unemployment, and no growth at all. Why did we do it? There are a whole range of records related to the Greek program. Record number 1, the most money ever given as a loan, as a fresh loan to any economy. The Greek economy got fresh loans of 240 billion euros. That's 105% of the Greek GDP. There is no way that IMF and the European partners have ever given a country a GDP as a fresh loan. One record. Second record, the growth of the public debt of the Greek economy. It was 120% and went 180%. Within a 3 years period, we got huge loans and huge growth of the problem that we were supposed to face. Record number 3, the recession, the unemployment, the decline, the destruction of the Greek economy. There is no way to solve the problems. The way that the Greek program was designed and implemented have to do with other concerns. It has nothing to do with the realities of the Greek economy and how to solve the problems of the Greek economy. It has to do with the way that the European political and economic elites decided to manage the economic crisis in Europe. It has nothing to do with the Greek case. That's why if you try to analyze the Greek problem within the Greek framework, there is no way to find a rational solution of what's going on. Is there a way out? We have to throw away this ridiculous Greek program, tear it apart, throw it out. It's a totally irrational thing. It will never work. Greece will never repay back its debt, never, because there is no way the plan cannot be solved in this specific way. Greece has to come back to growth. Greece has to face a huge humanitarian crisis. Greece has to go back into sensible solutions at a time when there is no way that we can postpone once more the Greek crisis. Thank you.
Definitely not the hope I was looking for. The Greek program failed completely, nonetheless passionate and very persuasive arguments. So in the sake of time, we have about 12, 13 minutes left before we break for lunch. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the audience. I'd like to collect maybe 2 or 3 questions first and then give the panel a chance to respond. Yes, sir.
I think it's safe to say, maybe it's an understatement, that this panel and the last panel are pretty anti-austerity. The region of the EU, or not, the EU, where there was the most extreme austerity was the Baltic states. They had a pretty extreme internal devaluation, but they're actually recovering pretty well right now. The biggest cheerleader for that is the Prime Minister of Estonia, who's been there for a long time, and Estonia in particular now has a lot lower unemployment, economic growth, and doing quite well. Does anyone have any theories of why the Baltic states, particularly Estonia, has recovered much better than the rest of Europe, particularly Southern Europe?
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, as we see immigration increase throughout from Southern Europe towards Northern Europe, how is the labor movement in the Northern European countries going to react to that immigration from within the European community?
Yes, sir. Yes, down here.
Thank you. I would like to comment on the 2 first speeches. Mr. Silva said only bankers are satisfied with the high unemployment figures. This I doubt. It's not only bankers. And then the other one was, if this is victory, well, it is victory. It depends whose victory it is. But if the figures that were in this wonderful presentation of Mr. Horn were not there, were the figure of wealth, of income, of redistribution. And of course, if you go for a certain model of the economy, then it is victory. And then, of course, you have some casualties on the side. But this aim is achieved. You have reduced the power of the trade unions. You have reduced real wages. You can, in the countries that are still better off, tell people, listen, we are in competition, Europe-wide, worldwide, and now you see they have these reforms in Spain and these reforms in Greece, so you can't really demand such high wage increases, or you have to give up this and that. In Austria, for instance, the Conservative Party, during the election, by the way, has propagated a 12-hour working day to become more flexible, more compatible, etc., etc. So you have a certain drive that is quite successful. I mean, too successful for me, I would say, from my own political opinion, that is grounded on that. And of course, you have the suffering you described, but you also have those who benefit from it.
Okay, If we could actually give the panelists a chance to respond to some of these questions. We've seen a bit of a pushback on the anti-austerity policy, as well as a question about immigration. So would you like to start, Damon?
Sure. I mean, I'm gonna not directly address the situation in Estonia because I'm not expert at it. I hope that Gustav can say a word or two that's better informed than mine. But I will say this, just about. I think it's quite dangerous to look at, and I think sometimes there are examples that I find heartening that are they're just so sort of small that it's that there's some economies that are very small are subject to a lot of idiosyncratic developments, and can be very dangerously deployed in overall arguments about macroeconomic policy. This is the this is the lesson of Reinhardt and Rogoff, if you think about it for a second, right? That it was really deeply insane to structure the entire, global economic policy based on data points like, what did New Zealand do in the 1980s? That was a crazy thing to do, even if they'd gotten it right? Even if they hadn't botched the numbers. The basic analytic proposition, the basic and sort of intellectual structure of that approach to understanding human society is batty, to use a term of art. I want to address the issue about immigration for a moment. See, what we're describing here is a tragedy, right? And it's a particular type of tragedy that we've already done once in the 20th century, and we're in danger of doing it again. It's a little unclear exactly how and to what degree of severity. In my presentation, when I alluded to what I had been told by European labor leaders about the attitudes of working people in Northern Europe about immigration, I was describing not the illegal immigrant, or not the undocumented workers that were coming into those countries from outside the EU. I was talking about their attitude toward internal immigration within the EU. Right? So the issue of internal immigration being perceived by some workers as driving down living standards in Northern Europe is real now. It's happening now. Now, here's the challenge. I mean, and for the Americans in the audience, this should not sound unfamiliar, right? The challenge of how progressive forces deal with the tensions around immigration is a very profound challenge in developed countries today. What I was expressing in my early remarks is that it's the view of the European labor movement wants to embrace an open society, a society where immigration is possible and where these fault lines don't attach. That's what they want. That's what the leadership of the European labor movement wants. It's deeply tied to the history of the labor movement as a bulwark against racism, and particularly in Europe. Maybe not always a successful bulwark, but it's not an accident that the first people Hitler put in prison were the leadership of the German unions. All right. Now, neoliberal economics and austerity economics, right, is making this impossible. And it is calling into question, the whole point of my presentation in the end is that it is calling into question in the minds of the political base of European sort of European Enlightenment influenced liberal democracy. It is calling that project into question at its base. Right. Now, the memory of this is gone now. The living memory of this is gone. But this is precisely what happened in Europe in the 1920s and the 1930s. Was it the combination of the fact that liberal democracies had blundered into, some liberal democracies had blundered into the First World War, and then the absolute inability, and in many cases refusal, of liberal democracies in Europe to do anything about the human suffering in the Great Depression, right? Is the core of what happened during that period. It delegitimized those governments and left those societies prey to totalitarianism of both the left and the right. The United States, by contrast, during that period, after a fair amount of pain, actually showed that liberal democracy could address economic pain. And then when Europe was rebuilt after World War II, it was rebuilt on the foundation that we would never again, as Democrats, with a small d, look the other way while this kind of pain went on in the society. And yet we are doing it, as soon as essentially the living memory of those events died, we went and did it again. And the reason why we went and did it again, I mean, I'm talking about we both in Europe and the United States. The reason why we went and did it again is because essentially of the political economy of plutocracy, which was alluded to by the third question.
We invite a few of the other panelists who would like to respond briefly.
Do you want to talk about the Estonia? Or what the economists do?
Okay, I want to address 2 points being made. The first one is Estonia. We have seen several examples being cited in due course of economic histories of successful consolidation. Expansionary contraction is the term being used in economics before the recent crisis, which was very much used. Meaning that if you cut down public expenditure, you will induce an expansion actually in the economy, because private trust into the public finances will increase, and people react to that increase in finance trust by increased spending and therefore compensate this fiscal construction. If you closely look at these cases, like Estonia or before, other Scandinavian countries have been named as examples, Sweden, Finland, you detect that the situation was completely different compared, for example, to Greece or to other countries now. Mainly, they were not in a currency union before they did the austerity, so they had still the instrument of nominal devaluation of their exchange rate. Secondly, they had their own monetary policy where they could reduce interest rates further, so to stimulate internal demand, which was clearly the case in Sweden and Finland at that time. All these are options that are not available anymore to Greece and other countries now. So you have to look at the circumstances under which you do an austerity policy. And it also helps if you're a very small country where your domestic income effect is relatively small compared to the substitution effect you get by a devaluation. This does definitely not apply to larger countries like Spain or Italy, so it's no way out for them. And you have to have a close look at the situation where you do consolidation policy. That's a basic lesson we draw from many incidents in the recent past. And the size of the multiplier varies very strongly with these circumstances. We have learned in the recent crisis, basically, the multiplier is not a constant thing. It varies, it's situative, and we should consider that. Then I want to address the last remark being made here, victory. You said, in fact, there is also victory. Okay, victory depends on the game you're playing. And my game I was playing was macroeconomic performance. And to macroeconomic performance means employment, growth, stability in the economy. And in that game, the European policy failed fundamentally. There may be another game, the distribution game. When you said it's a game that was really being played in Europe, that the higher incomes would benefit and higher wealth would benefit from this kind of strategy. Well, you're right in terms of distributive figures. The relative share of higher incomes has increased dramatically in some countries. That's definitely true. But also higher incomes suffer from a slack macroeconomic development. If there are no profits in an economy, especially higher incomes suffer from that. So even from that point of view, I would say there are better policies available even for the richer.
Okay, thanks. I think for the sake of time, I'd like to elicit 2 more questions I see here from the gentleman. Yes,
Thank you
please.
very much. In a former capacity, and I would like to ask a question to our Greek friend and colleague. In a former capacity, I was one of the 17 people that on 7 May of 2010 decided to say yes to a program to save Greece. Friday afternoon, we decided to, I think it was 110 billion euros. And of course, the plan afterwards was negotiated. And then I got a word of my colleague, Mr. Papandreou, that said, well, we will pay all efforts to put our country in a position to pay back. Okay, that's what happened, the 7th of May of 2010, without all kind of assessment analysis we have now before, because it's always easier to predict the past. But now I hear that it is impossible, that the plan has failed, that it is stupidity and so on, that the 17 people sitting around the table were stupid. I would just like to ask two simple questions to you. First, what is the solution for your country? I'm not in charge of your country. I mean, as a Deputy Secretary General of OECD, I'm in charge of all member states. I have to serve my member states, and I do it. But I mean, in my former capacity, I was just in charge of Belgium, and I was responsible to my parliament. So what is your solution? And secondly, there are some traditions I respect, habits. For instance, in the field of taxation, why is it so difficult to introduce taxation, for instance, of professional categories, activities like ship owners and other stuff? I went to my parliament and I said, well, we will take part in the 110 billion euro. It was not easy. It was not easy. We were just facing elections, very difficult elections, but I did it, and I got the confidence of my colleagues in the parliament and of the population. So could you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
One last question, and then I'm going to pose a challenge to the panelists, which is to answer in 30 seconds or less each, so we can get to lunch.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a methodological remark. We heard a lot about transatlantic with a passing reference to China, but except for Terri, we hardly heard anything about the South. Now, the difference between the Great Depression and now is that now the South matters a lot. I mean, of course, the South of the entire planet. I found the Baltic question quite fair. You know, it's quite true that small countries, and I am from one, you know, are countries too. And in that sense, I think that's more comparison of what is happening to the Eurozone and what happened to the Latin American countries with the last decade, long time to recover, as opposed to the Asian countries, the so-called Phoenix recovery goes well beyond the fact that there is no nominal exchange rate change available. So it's a methodological caveat, done, of course, with a good intention.
Okay, thank you very much. So we give the panelists 30 seconds each to respond, but also reminding you that there'll be plenty of opportunities to talk over lunch and during the afternoon and then tomorrow morning sessions.
Okay. Let me make the response very simple and easy. A, what we needed in 2010, prior to the discussion of the 110 billion, was a proper restructuring plan for the Greek debt. The 110 billion was followed by the PSI a year later. So the idea then was that no restructuring plan is on the agenda, which was wrong. A proper restructuring plan should have been the first step, together with all the other elements of the Greek program. B, the fiscal adjustment had to be realistic and much more gradual. And three, the element of growth and reform that had to be included in the package had to be much more balanced and related to the Greek reality rather than what has been implemented ever since with the Greek program, the way it was designed by IMF primarily. And I come to the final point concerning taxation. The Greek problem prior to 2008, and that's why I argue that the Greek program does not solve none of the problems that the Greek economy had, the Greek taxation system was very much similar to the European ones concerning the average income that we get from indirect taxation, value-added tax. We get exactly the European average. We get exactly the European average in terms of taxes on wage and salary taxes, classes, which means that we get in the income tax similar with the European average. We have a comparatively similar structure of public expenditure in terms of health, pensions, 1% of GDP is more pensions, education, defense, and so on and so forth. The only Greek peculiarity is the taxation of private business and rich people, those that are professionals or are getting their income from other sources. There, each and every year, in the last 30 years actually, there is a gap of 4.4 to 5% of our GDP, which is the taxation that the European countries get on average more from this category, which includes business plus wealthy people. So the problem was there, it was well known. Why it was not resolved prior to 2008 had to do with the Greek politics and the way that this functioned. But the real part of the story is that through Greek Program 1 and Greek Program 2, there is no solution to this problem to this very day.
Okay, Terri, through 30 seconds.
I don't really have a whole lot to add, except that I agree that there needs to be more discussion of the broader, and that's what I was saying at the end of my talk, is that we need to look at what's happening beyond the borders of Europe, and I've actually been surprised that there hasn't, I mean, I have seen some discussions of, you know, the situation in Argentina and how that reflects on the fact that we can't do devaluations and so on. But I haven't, like I said, what's really surprising to me is there just hasn't been much discussion of what's happening in the periphery, not of Europe, but the periphery around Europe. What's happening in, you know, Georgia, in, you know, some of the, well, Turkey is a prime example of a country that... No. But yes, the other Georgia. But Turkey and other countries that are directly impacted by what's going on in Europe. And so anyway, I would just argue, and just in terms of I didn't address the inter-EU migration issue, but I think it's an ongoing issue with the labor unions there, and what's going to happen with that is still, you know, I don't know that there's any clear answer.
Okay, Gustav, very quickly.
Yes, just in 30 seconds. Yes, the South matters now. That's a difference towards the 30s, yes. But what does it mean in my context being presented? Does it invalidate all their arguments? I don't think so. The euro area is one of the strongest economic powers in the world and one of the largest. So if it is in a crisis, it affects also the South. And it hampers the global economic development, which are closely interlinked here now. So I don't think that the problem becomes easier because the South matters. It's rather the danger that we do much harm on other countries too by making the wrong policy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Damon, last word.
Yeah. So I really appreciated, Eve, your question, because it's the real question that this morning really sets up, is what is that it's not a lack of good policy ideas. There are a number of them, and clearly some of them were put on the table at various times during the crisis, right? And people tried to do things. The question is, and we've had a bunch of good ideas here today, but in this panel and the last panel, the question is, what is the political strategy? Right? What is the political strategy for reversing what we have, I think, fairly persuasively documented as a downward spiral of political economy in Europe? And I use the word political economy very consciously. This is not just an economic problem. If we're going to have a political strategy, we need to begin by building on positive moves within countries that some people are critical of, like Germany. I really hope my remarks were not interpreted by anybody as a kind of anti-German thing. I don't think that at all. You look at Germany's management of its own crisis in 2008, 2009, it's admirable, as was said, I think, by one of the questioners. Building on things like the DGB, the German Union's Marshall Plan, as political instruments is very important. Third, the question of the Global South. Europe needs not just to think about the experience of the Global South during the 1990s and during both Latin America and Asia, but it's critical to tap the political leadership that grew out of those experiences in the Global South for help in this situation. And I will tell you two things and then stop. There was a joint conference on reviving growth and employment in Europe in Paris, sponsored by the Lula Institute, by President Lula, former President Lula of Brazil, and by the Jean Jaurès Institute, which is the Institute of the French Socialist Party. At that meeting, the two finance ministers of the two countries spoke. The extraordinary thing about the speech was that, about this presentation, was that the finance minister of France basically sort of said, well, you know, things aren't that bad, it might work out, let's give us a little more time, that kind of thing. And the finance minister of Brazil said, you're bleeding the patient. This is disastrous what you're doing in Europe, and it's hurting us. That's the kind of political leadership we need in this crisis, and perhaps some of it can come from the South. I'll finally just close with this notion of learning from the recent past. It's not just the global South you need to learn from. It's the US experience and it's the Japanese experience. And I will close with something deeply ironic, and I need you to think, just listen to what I'm saying carefully. During the process of the congressional oversight of the TARP, of the US bank bailout, I made it a habit of asking Tim Geithner on every occasion in which he appeared before us to explain to us why we were not repeating the Japanese experience of the lost decade, because we did not resolve our banks. And Tim knew that I knew that he had been the US commercial attaché in Tokyo at the time and was well versed in this matter. And at one point he said to me, he said, the reason why this is going to be different is because the Japanese pursued inconsistent fiscal policy. And we're not going to do that in the United States.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel for a great discussion.